The war was ending, though none of the women knew it yet. To them, the final months of 1945 felt like an extension of endless misery, each day carved from the same stone of humiliation and hunger. They were called comfort women, a bitter term that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with control. Some were Japanese, but many were Korean or from occupied territories, pulled into the machine of empire and discarded into ramshackle compounds near military outposts. They lived in long huts of bamboo and tin, the roofs leaking in rainstorms, the floorboards splintered under bare feet. Every morning they woke to the same drill. Roll call shouted by guards, a meager ration of rice or millet, and then the waiting. Waiting for soldiers, waiting for orders, waiting for more of the same degradation that had defined their lives since capture. They had been taught by the Imperial Army that their role was sacrifice, that serving in silence was patriotism. But in private whispers, late at night, they shared only despair. In those months, the women had little left of themselves. Hunger had carved them into hollow figures. Their hair grew thin, their gums bled, their skin bruised at the slightest touch. Some were no older than 18. A few had once been nurses or students. Others had been farmers' daughters who thought the war would pass them by. All were now reduced to shadows of the lives they remembered. Propaganda filled the silence when they were not working. Japanese officers reminded them constantly, "If the Americans come, you will suffer worse. You will be humiliated beyond imagination. They will treat you as less than animals." These warnings became a mantra, drilled into their exhausted minds. To surrender was not an option, they were told. Capture meant shame so deep it would follow them to the grave. The women believed it. They had no reason not to. They had seen the cruelty of war firsthand. They had watched friends collapse from disease, had carried others to shallow graves dug at the edge of the compounds. They knew the face of brutality, and they assumed it wore the same uniform no matter which flag flew above it. At night, some whispered prayers. Others wept silently into thin blankets. A few clung to small tokens of the past, a ribbon tucked into a pocket, a photograph smuggled from home, a scrap of cloth embroidered with a name. These objects became their last anchors of identity, proof that they had once been more than what war had made them. Then came the change. In January 1945, the distant rumble of artillery began to echo across the hills. At first it was only faint, thunder without lightning, low rumbles that might have been storms. But soon the sounds grew louder, sharper. Shells cracked in the distance, flashes lit the horizon at night. The Japanese officers grew tense, their tempers shorter, their voices louder. Orders came with urgency. Guards shouted at one another. Supplies dwindled further. The war was closing in. The women whispered among themselves. Some dared to hope that liberation might come, but the hope was laced with fear because they remembered the warnings. The Americans were coming, yes, but with them would come the humiliation they had been taught to dread. As the weeks dragged on, the artillery grew nearer. Columns of smoke rose in the distance, black plumes twisting into the sky. Sometimes aircraft droned overhead, their shadows sweeping across the compound. The guards barked at the women to stay inside, to stay silent, as if their voices alone might summon death from the sky. Then one morning the women awoke to silence. No roll call, no barked orders, no sound of boots on gravel. They stepped cautiously into the yard and found the guard towers empty. The Japanese soldiers had vanished overnight. The gates still stood, but beyond them stretched an eerie stillness. The women stared at one another, unsure whether to feel relief or terror. Hours later, the distant rumble returned, louder now, closer. This was not thunder. It was the sound of war itself rolling toward them. The ground trembled with each concussion. The women huddled together in the yard, eyes wide, ears straining. And then came the unmistakable sound of gunfire, rifles cracking, machine guns rattling. The front was no longer distant. It was at their doorstep. Panic swept through the compound. Some women collapsed to their knees, sobbing. Others clutched each other tightly, whispering prayers, apologies, anything to fill the air with human voices. They did not know what was coming, only that it was coming fast. As the sun dipped low, the first American scouts appeared at the tree line. The women saw them through the barbed wire, tall figures in helmets, rifles slung, uniforms stained with dirt. Their hearts stopped. This was the moment they had been warned of. The monsters had arrived. The women pressed back against the barracks, trembling. Some covered their faces. Others whispered, "This is the end." The sound of boots grew louder as more soldiers emerged, surrounding the compound. Shouts in English rang out, sharp, commanding, impossible to understand. The gates creaked open. The women braced themselves for humiliation. The gates creaked wider, and the women huddled against the walls felt their hearts pound so violently they thought they might faint. Boots struck gravel, steady and purposeful. They dared to lift their eyes, and froze. The soldiers looked nothing like the demons they had been taught to fear. These were not rabid men foaming at the mouth, nor monstrous giants intent on abuse. They were weary, mud-stained soldiers moving with discipline. Their helmets were scuffed, rifles slung at the ready, but their eyes carried no cruelty. Instead, there was something the women had not expected: caution, and even gentleness. One American sergeant raised his hand, palm out. The gesture, so ordinary, sent ripples of confusion through the captives. He barked an order, and a medic stepped forward. The medic wasn't carrying a weapon at all, only a Red Cross armband and a satchel bulging with bandages. For a moment the women did not move. They remained pressed against the wall, trembling. Then the medic knelt slowly, pulled a tin from his bag, and placed it on the ground where they could see. A can of condensed milk. He opened another pouch and set out chocolate bars, biscuits, soap. The items seemed unreal, like props from a dream. One of the women, too weak to stand without support, began to sob. She had not tasted chocolate since before the war. The smell of cocoa drifted toward her, rich and sweet, and the dam of fear cracked. She crawled forward on her knees, hesitating, then snatched the bar. The Americans did not strike her, they did not laugh. Instead, the medic smiled faintly and set another bar beside her trembling hands. The spell broke. Other women edged forward, still wary, their movements hesitant as animals expecting a trap. The soldiers remained motionless, rifles slung low, watching without menace. Soon the yard filled with the sound of wrappers tearing, of biscuits crumbling between desperate teeth. Some women wept openly as they chewed, the sweetness overwhelming, their stomachs unprepared for such richness. Others pressed bars of soap to their faces, inhaling the clean scent like incense, proof that life beyond filth and degradation still existed. The moment was surreal. All their lives they had been told that Americans would strip them of dignity. Yet here, on the very day of liberation, the Americans were restoring it piece by piece: food, soap, kindness. One of the women later wrote in her diary, "We expected chains. Instead, they gave us chocolate. We expected to be spat on. Instead, they bowed their heads as if we were worthy of care." Within hours, the compound was transformed. American medics moved from hut to hut, examining wounds, taking pulses, administering quinine for malaria, sulfur for infections. Nurses, women in uniform, joined them, carrying clipboards and distributing blankets. To the captives, the sight of women among the liberators was disorienting. They had been told Americans were barbaric, obsessed with pleasure, devoid of respect for women. Yet here were female officers commanding authority, their presence radiating professionalism. The guards who had abandoned the compound left behind chaos, but the Americans brought order. They organized rations into neat stacks. They set up water stations. They separated the sickest women and carried them, literally carried them, into makeshift infirmaries. One woman, her feet ulcerated from years of untreated infection, remembered being lifted gently by a soldier. She expected mockery. Instead, he spoke softly. "You're safe now. We've got you." It was too much. She wept into his shoulder, her tears soaking his uniform. The propaganda that had defined their worldview cracked wider with each passing hour. They had been told Americans were racially degenerate, men without honor. Yet here were black soldiers handing out rations with steady hands, Latino medics applying bandages, white officers bowing politely as they explained procedures through interpreters. The entire spectrum of America's diversity stood before them, united in discipline, in respect. At nightfall, the women lay on blankets instead of splintered floorboards. For the first time in years, they slept without fear of guards bursting through the door. The air was filled not with shouts or groans, but with the soft murmur of American sentries patrolling the perimeter, voices calm, movements steady. Safety had arrived wearing foreign uniforms. The next morning brought more shocks. Trucks rolled into the compound, laden with crates marked with the unmistakable Red Cross. The parcels were opened in front of them. Canned meats, powdered milk, sugar, coffee, toothbrushes, combs, sanitary items. Each woman was given a parcel of her own. For years they had shared scraps of food, divided slivers of soap into dozens of pieces. Now they held entire boxes filled with abundance. One parcel contained lipstick. The women stared at it, bewildered. A soldier explained through an interpreter that it was for them, to make them feel like themselves again. Some laughed for the first time in years, applying bright streaks to their lips with trembling hands. In that moment, the war-worn compound briefly transformed into a place of color, of fragile joy. Letters were offered too. Not many. Communication with home was still slow, censored, but the promise was there. One woman wrote shakily to her mother, "I was not shamed. They treat us with respect. Believe nothing they told us." Every day brought a new reversal. When the women lined up for food, soldiers saluted them politely, as if they were honored guests rather than prisoners. When they bathed in water tanks set up in the yard, guards turned their backs respectfully, maintaining privacy. When they asked timidly for more soap, more bandages, the requests were granted without hesitation. The collapse of indoctrination was complete. They had expected degradation. Instead, they were given dignity. They had expected to be cast aside, but instead they were cared for as human beings. One evening, as the sun set blood red over the compound, a young woman whispered to her friend, "If everything they told us about the Americans was a lie, then what else was a lie?" It was not just liberation of the body. It was the beginning of liberation of the mind. The days after liberation unfolded like a dream the women could barely comprehend. They had braced themselves for humiliation, convinced that surrender to the Americans would strip them of whatever scraps of identity they had left. Instead, with each sunrise, their sense of humanity was being stitched back together, not by words, but by actions so ordinary they seemed miraculous. The first miracle was the food. The Americans brought rations daily, tins of Spam, loaves of white bread, cans of fruit cocktail. Coffee boiled in metal pots, the bitter aroma filling the compound. The women wept as they chewed, their mouths overwhelmed by sweetness and fat, their stomachs aching as they adjusted to abundance. For years they had nibbled scraps, their bodies wasting away. Now soldiers urged them to eat more, piling plates with generosity that bordered on disbelief. The second miracle was medicine. Doctors and nurses moved methodically through the compound, treating festering wounds, infections, malnutrition. Needles pricked arms, delivering vaccines and quinine. Pills were handed out like treasure. One woman, who had lived with untreated malaria for 2 years, felt the fever break within days. Another, suffering from beriberi, found strength returning to her legs. The sight of American doctors kneeling beside them, listening to heartbeats through stethoscopes, was almost incomprehensible. And then came the showers. Trucks rolled in tanks of heated water. Pipes were rigged, curtains hung. For the first time in years, the women stepped into streams of warm water that cascaded over their shoulders, washing away grime, parasites, and despair. They lathered with soap until their skin turned pink, laughing and crying at once. Some held their faces in their hands, overwhelmed by the sheer luxury of cleanliness. A few emerged trembling, whispering, "I am human again." The Americans provided clothes next. Dresses, skirts, blouses donated from home. The women slipped them on, marveling at the soft fabrics. They twirled awkwardly, their thin frames lost in the folds, but they smiled through tears. For the first time in years, they looked in mirrors and saw not prisoners, not comfort women, but women again. Even more shocking than food or clothing was the behavior of the soldiers themselves. The Americans treated them with respect. They bowed politely, addressed them as ladies, and ensured privacy whenever possible. Black soldiers, whom Japanese propaganda had demonized as savages, offered chocolate with steady hands and gentle smiles. White officers saluted them in greeting. Female American nurses supervised their care, showing authority and compassion in equal measure. Everything the women had been told about their supposed enemies crumbled before their eyes. One night, the compound filled with music. An American unit had set up a gramophone, and swing tunes drifted through the humid air. The women sat in stunned silence at first, unused to such sounds, then slowly began to sway, some humming along. Laughter rippled through the yard, a sound not heard there in years. A soldier even offered a shy bow and asked one of the women to dance. She hesitated, fear flickering, then placed her hand in his. They stepped awkwardly in the dust, moving to music that carried them far from barbed wire and shame. The Red Cross continued to deliver parcels, each one a revelation. Toothbrushes, sanitary pads, notebooks, even lipstick. One woman wrote later, "The first time I painted my lips red, I felt as though I had stolen back a part of myself the war had tried to erase." As weeks passed, the women grew stronger. Their cheeks filled out, their eyes brightened. Some began to smile easily, others remained cautious, haunted by memories. At night, many still woke in terror, convinced the guards would return. Some hoarded food beneath pillows, unable to shake the fear of hunger. Yet, gradually, the weight of fear lessened, replaced by something fragile but enduring: hope. When orders came to evacuate, the women were loaded onto trucks and driven through villages reduced to rubble. Filipino civilians lined the roads, some cheering, others staring silently. The women clutched their parcels, their new clothes, their fragile sense of dignity. For the first time, they saw the devastation of war beyond their compound. Burned homes, cratered fields, children with hollow eyes. They realized they were not alone in suffering. The entire land had been scarred. At American bases, the women encountered yet more shocks: dining halls filled with food, barracks with real beds, clinics with shelves of medicine. They were offered writing paper to send letters home. Some wept as they wrote, unsure if their families were alive to receive them. Others hesitated, ashamed to reveal what had happened. Yet the Americans encouraged them. "Tell them you are safe now. That's what matters." Cultural shock continued to ripple through their days. They saw American women in uniform, commanding respect from men. They saw soldiers of many races working side by side, contradicting everything Japanese propaganda had drilled into them. They watched chaplains lead services where prisoners were welcome, bowed heads blending across lines of former enemies. Some women could not reconcile it. They retreated inward, clinging to silence. Others embraced the new reality, laughing with nurses, even learning fragments of English. But all carried the same astonishment. Liberation had not meant shame. It had meant respect. Decades later, survivors would remember the smallest details: the smell of soap, the sweetness of chocolate, the sound of soldiers bowing their heads when addressing them. These became lifelong symbols of dignity restored. One survivor said, "The war told us we were nothing." The Americans told us we were still women. Another whispered, I believed humiliation was certain. Instead, they handed me soap. I washed my face, and I felt alive again. The legacy of those days lingered long after the war ended. Some women rebuilt their lives quietly, never speaking of captivity. Others shared their testimonies late in life, describing how the collapse of propaganda had begun not with speeches, but with parcels, a bar of chocolate, a toothbrush, a blanket. These were the instruments of truth that undid years of lies. To historians, the story is about power, empire, and the end of a war. But to the women who lived it, it was about something simpler, the rediscovery of their humanity. They had expected liberation to bring only deeper shame. Instead, it brought dignity. And that dignity arrived not in grand gestures, but in the humblest of forms. Soap lathering in a bucket, chocolate melting on the tongue, a soldier's respectful bow.